Hello and welcome to Why We Write, a program that interviews EMU faculty members about writing and teaching. I'm your host, Randall Beyer. My guest today is Professor Kate Pantelides of Eastern Michigan University's Department of English Language and Literature. Dr. Pantelides is the Associate Director of EMU's first-year writing program and specializes in the teaching of writing, the theory of composition, rhetorical genre studies, and the analysis of discourse. She's the author of Meta-Genre on the WPA listserv, Transitional Threads as Nexus for Micro-Macro Level Discourse on the Dissertation, recently published in Composition Forum. In addition, Dr. Pantelides has published in various other journals, including Composition Studies, Computers and Composition and International Journal, Academic Exchange Quarterly, and College Composition and Communication. Welcome to Why We Write.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, I hope the next half hour will have some fruitful insights and discoveries. But first, I always ask a guest on this program about why we write. Why do we write as people or collectively? But also, why do you write? I see you write about writing itself, about genres such as dissertations as a genre, and also the process of writing. I wonder if you could tell us something about those.
Absolutely. Well, I guess literally we write to communicate. A lot of what I talk about with my students about why we write is we write to think, to reflect, to learn. I think that when we think about writing broadly in that context, not just to communicate with somebody else, but also kind of to learn about ourselves and the things that we're learning. This sort of more expansive definition of what writing is and what it can do. I think that's very generative for students, and it's certainly been very generative in my work.
It's interesting what happens when you write something. Your mind, I don't know why this works. Maybe you can, tell us. But thoughts come into your head that were literally not there before when you started. And it's the process that kind of generates that. When you said writing as thinking, it's always been a little confusing to me how that happens, and yet I know that's what goes on. You think of things that you had not thought of before.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's some sort of the basis of composition. Just this belief that, and there's a lot of research to support this, but that instead of just saying, here's a paper, it's due on Monday, just go ahead and write it. Instead of that, when you actually go through the process of writing, so you talk about, all right, here's an assignment prompt. What am I actually asking you to do? And why am I asking you to do this? And who's going to be your audience? And what particular situation is setting up this writing project? When you think about that, and then you actually write about writing the project, this sort of metacognitive connection, that students write better. It's an easier writing process, and then they can actually transfer the skills that they use in writing that project to other places.
Thinking about what happens, reflecting, I guess, on the process itself.
Right.
Well, what got you interested in this, either as a child or as a scholar when you were doing your studies and writing your dissertation? How got you to writing instead of another kind of career path? I've
always been writing. I have endless, and I'm doing this for my children now too, saving all the things that they're writing. But I have endless boxes that I don't know what I'll ever do with. I'll be the woman with all the boxes of old writing in my house, and nothing else. But my parents always saved all these stories that I would write, and we have books from my elementary school, books that I wrote. But I remember very clearly when I first started thinking about writing, sort of not just as something fun, but something that you have to organize, that writing takes arrangement, that it takes thinking, that it's a process.
Yeah.
Because I had to write a research paper about tapeworms in 5th grade.
Okay. Perfect 5th grade assignment.
Right. Yeah, which is totally disgusting. I remember being very excited about it. And I remember talking to my father, who's also a professor of physics. about writing the paper, and he's like, well, Kate, you have to organize it. And I remember saying, like, crying and saying, I don't have to organize it. My teacher told me I didn't have to. And after, you know, that drama with him, we ended up like doing note cards, and I think I still have the note cards.
That's great.
About tapeworms, and I organized it. So that was like the early connection. But the piece that started me on my trajectory now is I was a writing center peer tutor in my undergraduate work at Bowdoin. And that was just an amazing experience.
You just got the bug for it, kind of.
Well, definitely the bug for it. I mean, I'd always been writing, but this idea about like, well, you can teach writing.
You started thinking deeper about it, like,
and about why I write, and you know, not just doing it, but thinking about why I did it, and what made it better at times and more difficult at others. And I took a writing theory and practice course, and it absolutely changed the way that I thought about writing, and directly connected with, you know, why I ended up being a professor.
Yeah, right, going on that pathway.
Yeah.
Well, regarding the scholarly work you've done, I see that you've had some pretty interesting subtitles.
Okay.
And as I mentioned to you before we started talking, I sort of think of titles with the colon as this kind of academic haiku. After the colon, you've written things such as macro level discourse on the dissertation, the paper you wanted to talk about on the listserv, about the listserv process, and pronouns as ways of re-examining posing. I was kind of intrigued by why you chose that topic as something to write about and what's important about that. So the detailed processes that you were looking at in those articles, I wonder if you could tell us something about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I like what you're saying about the colon being this academic haiku, and I think there's actually a lot of work to be done in understanding titles and how they set us up and what work they're doing.
They're so small, but they have so much kind of...
They do a lot of work.
Exactly, right.
Yeah. And mine aren't as small as probably they should be, so that's, again, why I can't remember them. But, the last one you mentioned, pronouns as a way of re-examining composing, that comes from an article about looking at how writers talk about their work in the Writing Center.
Okay.
And so I analyzed, I think, I have to remember now, but I think 5 interviews, 5 writing consultations in the Writing Center. And I looked at this sort of interesting navigation in the beginning of a writing consultation, especially about how the consultant would say, well, what are we working on today sometimes?
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes they would switch after the student would say, well, I have this really difficult project, and we're going to have to work on it all day, and blah, blah, blah. And then sometimes the consultant would say, well, so what are you going to do?
It changes from we to you. Yes,
right. So
exactly.
That affiliation and that disaffiliation, and why we choose to claim things at certain times. So that's a really it's micro discourse analysis.
Yes. Okay.
Of what happens in a consultation, and some people talk about that as power dynamics. I don't so much. I think it's just sort of how we create conversations, and certainly authorship. So that's my interest there.
Right. That's about spoken discourse, but how does it transfer into, the writing aspect? I mean, it's discourse about writing.
Right.
But what happens after that? I mean, that's a little bit off topic from what I asked you, but it's something I was thinking as you were talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly that specific article is about how we talk about our writing.
Yeah.
But that's all part of the process. I think, and my work does both. I often look at spoken discourse, more often written discourse, but that is part of the writing process, and especially writing center pedagogy suggests that that talking about writing is an integral part of it. So part of invention strategies. So you can just write, but often there's a lot of research to suggest that students find, and I know that I find, much more success when I talk about my writing in the beginning stages, and the revision stages, and the final stages. It's again, that notion of writing as thinking, talking about writing as part of the writing process,
Right,
just more inclusive.
When you were talking about your 5th grade tapeworm article, I was thinking about, as children we do a lot of illustrating. Now you're talking about talking. So there's really a multi-leveled, multi-sensual, or what is it, multiple intelligences going on in writing. Writing is just not, it is getting words on paper, but there are other things happening. I mean, you talk about it, you re-edit, you might have an illustration that and they all sort of fit together. It's the thought passing as you were explaining that.
Well,
that's kind of fascinating.
Certainly in composing. So often we're talking about composition instead of just writing, because it's about composing. And composing is recursive. So exactly what you're saying. It's never, we used to talk about it a little bit more as linear. And that's my interest certainly in dissertation writing, that in the work that I did about the dissertation process. But it's not just linear. You don't just have an idea and then write about it and then revise it and then defend a dissertation.
Right.
You go back and
It's not
forth.
so formulaic as you might think. And that might be part of the, I don't know, the fear or the hesitancy that a lot of writers coming in, college writers, have to get through or work through in some way.
Absolutely.
We're going to come back and talk some more, but I have a lot of more questions. I hope we can explore that.
Absolutely.
I think I've got to maybe ask one more question. Okay, we're asking one more question.
Okay.
All right. I can take off on that because you talked about the dissertation and whatnot. I'm interested in how one writes about writing while you're thinking about writing.
Oh, yeah.
That's kind of interesting. You've written about argumentation, for instance. What's going on in your head? And it seems like it might even be stifling a little bit.
Yeah, so this whole notion of writing about writing is very, it's very of the moment in writing studies. This is kind of where a lot of, especially first-year writing, a lot of the pedagogy of first-year writing is going. And certainly in my own experience, and I talk to my students about this writing about writing notion all of the time.
Yeah.
And I do it in my own work. But I certainly remember, again, going back to this course at Bowdoin that was so influential for me, that piece that was so transformative, that instead of just writing, I was writing, about my thought processes. And I had a moment mid-semester where I just couldn't write. I had all of these voices in my head.
Too many thoughts about.
Right.
You can't move forward.
Right. As soon as I would write something down, I'd think, oh, well, that will do this, and this will be the impact of whatever I write here. And it was debilitating for about a week. And I talked to my professor about it, and I said, I'm loving this, but I can't write anymore. And she's like, well, you've developed genre awareness. You've developed a writing awareness, and that's so useful. And now you just need to know to silence it a little bit in the writing process.
Okay.
And be gentle with yourself when you're developing. And all those things that you're thinking, all those voices in your head is how I described it, and I continue to describe it that way to my students. Silence them for a moment and be with yourself and generous in the invention stage. And then when you're revising, when you're rethinking this, when you're reworking your document, then bring in those kind of analytical voices. But the whole idea behind this writing about writing notion is that you learn from your writing, you're more critical, you're more strategic about your writing. You're essentially a better writer if you are able to analyze what you're doing and
Right. This is where editing comes in, I guess.
Yeah.
Taking a kind of a broader view of what you've written and going back and doing it again.
Right.
I know, especially in first-year programs, and I think any writer will say that editing is like the critical thing, and don't be afraid of it or whatever.
Right. Writing is revision.
Good. Okay, so now we will take a short break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about that. I'd like to know more about rhetorical genre studies and things like that.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Pterosaurs are often called pterodactyls because of the structure of their wing. Pterodactyl, in fact, means winged finger, and the wing did indeed consist solely of a large finger. Pterosaurus was enormously large. A membrane of skin extended from the tip of this finger to either the side of the body or the hind limb.
So now it's midterms, and you seem to be missing some steps between the evolution of winged mammals and the first space shuttle? Easier said than done, you say? Well, for starters, try and get down the main points. Then if you have time, get down some examples. Abbreviate frequently used names. Make Martin Luther King. Oedipus Rex can be. Places. Abbreviate any frequently used words. You're also more likely to retain the material if you review your notes as soon as possible and recopy them so they're more legible, highlighting the high points.
You're an individualist, a person who can stand against all adversity.
But your grades suck.
Group study.
The best way to learn is to try and teach someone else. And when you study with someone else, you can compare notes and better determine what will be on the test. You can use the quiz bowl method.
What's the airspeed velocity of a laden English swallow?
There's safety in numbers. If there's a problem you all have on a test, you can go to the professor as a group.
And always, try and study with people who are stronger students than yourself.
We're back talking with Dr. Kate Pantelides about writing and about the teaching of writing. And I actually wanted to talk about genre studies because I know that's your expertise and the writing process, but also rhetorical genre studies, which sounds like a very deep subject, but I'm sure you could break it down to you know, its component parts for us, especially based on your dad's advice about organizing and all that.
Yeah.
But could you tell us something about understanding genres of writing? I imagine that would follow from rhetorical genre studies, and to me it means something akin to the way you, I know we use the term argument a lot, the way you make a point, make an argument, or invent a structure of some kind that, you know, we think of science fiction, blogs, different types. I think I'm on track with those as genres, but I don't quite understand this sort of academic approach to that and how that affects writing.
Yeah, I mean, this whole notion of rhetorical genre studies, and certainly, again, a lot of what's happening in the first year writing classroom is that we want students to think about writing rhetorically and to develop genre awareness. And by doing that, they'll be able to transfer what they do in that class into other contexts. So if we just approach a writing classroom saying, okay, students, you're going to write the 5-paragraph essay, and we're just going to talk about writing the 5-paragraph essay, and we're going to do it a lot, and you're going to be great at writing a 5-paragraph essay. What happens when that student has to write a 10-paragraph essay or a 10-page essay? That isn't really... It
doesn't transfer or extend in a way. Yeah,
right. Because how many in your life are you going to write a 5-paragraph essay outside of a classroom? Probably, I can't think of many contexts. So instead of approaching writing that way in this kind of formulaic, like let's count the paragraphs and make sure that your writing functions that way. Even though that's initially easier, because you say, well, this sentence looks like this sentence looks like this paragraph looks like this. If instead you're talking about the work those paragraphs do, if you talk about them rhetorically.
Okay, you got 5, at least in your example.
Right.
So each one has to have a slightly different function.
Right.
Sure.
So so if you're talking in those terms, so what does this do rhetorically? Why would you use this? How might somebody respond to this particular writing situation, and why would they do that? If you ask students to think about writing that way, it's a little bit more complicated in the teaching process, but then it actually translates outside of the classroom. So I guess I'm answering that question in 2 different ways.
No, that's fine, because I want to explore, your thoughts about it. It all works.
Okay, good. So rhetorical genre studies then says, instead of looking at genres as kind of formulas or as equations.
Right. I think maybe I've been mistakenly thinking of them as formulas myself in a way.
And it's okay to do that. I think we often do that, and that's not wrong in any way. It's just this is what rhetorical genre studies does to kind of turn the way that we look at it. So again, so that when we try to approach genres in different contexts, we can be successful. And again, I'm thinking about this in terms of how we teach students to write in different genres. Right. So if we talk about them rhetorically, instead of looking at genres as formulas, as equations, we look at them as social actions. And what action does this genre accomplish? What work does it do? What kind of is it?
Okay.
And
you personalize it in a way, or anthropomorphize it.
Yeah, that's a good way.
A social action. I mean, it's a thing that has agency of some kind.
Exactly. And again, that's kind of what rhetorical genre studies does generally. Also, it says that writing does something. It's not just words on a page. It has, not that writing itself has agency necessarily, although some people say that, but that it does work. And so when we look at genres that way, so instead of, and I'll use a different genre than 5-paragraph essay because that's kind of an artificial genre created for the university.
That's right.
But like
has its own issues, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you look at instead various like forms, genres are ways that we communicate with each other, and they're kind of shorthand. So when you go to a form, you have certain expectations of what that form is going to do because you've experienced forms before.
Yes, yeah.
And if you create a form, so in the library, if you have a new program or something, and you go to create a form so that people can participate in the program, you don't have to start over and say, okay, people are going to come to. This is common sense, so it's silly to talk about it in this context.
But they know what's expected.
Right, and if you're creating a form, you know where you can draw from because you know the conventions of a form, you know the purpose of the form, and you know what audience members do when they get a form. So if we were to get a form that didn't ask us to fill anything out, we'd be very confused because that's not what a form is supposed to do. And so anyway, thinking about genres in that context, really understanding the exigency or the reason that they're meant to be, the action that they're meant to accomplish, and what creates them. If we talk about them in those terms, then it's much more generative. Then we can be really strategic, we can be really successful in approaching outside of the classroom in using them to our benefit.
So you're talking also about thinking about everyday writing as well as formal writing, like I'm going to write a story, but also just how do I write on the web? How do I communicate effectively if I have a blog or that sort of the more popular kind of writing?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of what we're trying to do in the first year writing classroom to help students recognize that they are writers. They're writing all the time. They are usually very talented writers. They're very persuasive. They're very rhetorical in the writing that they do for themselves, especially in social media. So if we can connect kind of what they know about writing in those spaces, in academic spaces or in broader professional spaces, they can be much more successful.
You write about the writing process as well. I know that your dissertation was about the dissertation.
Yeah.
What brought you to talk about to have a dissertation about dissertating? That kind of intrigued me.
Yeah, it was a very meta project.
Yeah, right.
Well, I was working in the Writing Center again, so most of my career has been centered around Writing Center work, and I was working with a lot of interdisciplinary students that were developing their dissertations, and they kept coming up against similar problems. And a lot of those difficulties were because the notion of writing a dissertation was popularly thought, or there's discourses that circulate about how the dissertation is this kind of linear process.
Yeah, right.
And they kept saying, well,
I've read a lot of those books actually.
Okay.
How to survive your dissertation.
Yes,
what do you really,
what
are you doing? What happens? Do you really want to be a college teacher? Here's the,
Right.
And I think you might have addressed that, like the magic of give me the formula or whatever to succeeding here.
Right, and there's no formula.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of confusion. Bless you. There's a lot of confusion because there's lots of different ideas about what is the purpose of a dissertation.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, that's where the interest came from, just working with other students in the Writing Center. And that's where most of my research questions come from, working with students on their writing in the classroom, in the Writing Center, in the first-year writing program. So I have a question, and I follow it up with research, and then I bring it back to my teaching.
Okay. I didn't want to leave without asking you about the concept of meta-genre, because I know that we introduced you talking about your analysis of listserv conversations, which is something you write about. What is the meta-genre of that?
Yeah, so meta-generic discourse is any place where you're talking about how to compose a genre.
Yeah.
So that will be instruction manuals, any kind of handbook, guidebook, whatever. And so I suggest that the listserv is really a place also of, often, not always, but of meta-generic commentary. And it's often about the dissertation. So people are talking about how do you write a dissertation, why.
Right.
And so I'm really interested in
macro.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I'm really interested in sites of meta-generic discourse.
That's interesting.
Because I think we learned about genre a lot in those places.
Right, yeah. Well, you've really opened up a lot of further topics for conversation. I want to thank you for visiting.
Thank you.
Coming in and talking about why we write, and I hope we can, talk in another year or so about another program. We'll do an update.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for being with us today. Here we are. Hello. Thanks for being with us today for another edition of Why We Write. I've been talking with Dr. Kate Pantelides of the English Language and Literature Department. I'm your host, Randall Beyer. Please come again. Thanks for being with us.